Are you ready to pump your podcast up a few notches with podcast survey questions? It seems like everyone and their dog has a podcast these days. We're looking at you with a dog podcast. So how do you stand out from the crowd with unique ideas and interesting guests? One way to do this is with podcast surveys. It's important to ask both your listeners and your guests for feedback and take their ideas and notes into consideration. I'm Noel, and in today's video, we'll discuss the top podcast survey questions to ask guests and listeners. Let's go. Surveys are an amazing way to tap into your subscribers and listeners. But surveys can serve beyond that purpose. They're also a great way for producers and hosts to gather feedback from guests. With the help of podcast surveys, you can continue to do what people love and tweak the things that aren't working, or completely leave them behind. If you're ready to revamp your podcast with the help of podcast surveys, check out these helpful survey questions. A lot of podcasts currently on the market involve a host and a rotating guest with each new episode. This keeps the convo fresh and interesting. If you want to take the pulse of how your podcast guests are enjoying their experience, you can send pre- and post-podcast interview surveys. Pre-podcast surveys can ask the guest to provide more context about the planned discussion points. Post-podcast surveys can garner feedback on the host's style of questioning or logistical issues. A great question asked that might seem a little obvious is, how did you get your start? This question lets the guest tell their story, and people love listening to a hero's journey. You could also ask these pre-interview questions. What is your area of expertise? What topics would you like to cover in this episode? Are there any topics that are off limits during this show? Some post-interview questions could include, were you comfortable and engaged during your interview? Is there anything we can do to make the interview process more enjoyable? How would you rate your experience on this podcast? Do you have any feedback for the host? Would you be interested in coming back as a guest on this podcast? While feedback from guests can help you shape the ins and outs of your interview style, feedback from your listeners will teach you about your episodes themselves, what your listeners enjoy, what they think needs improvement, and what they find unique and memorable about your podcast. It's good practice to use a mix of both open-ended and close-ended survey questions. Doing so can help you understand their sentiments on specific elements better. We're talking about anything from the quality of your guests to the type of commentary you provide. One survey is better than none, but to really get your podcast to a whole new level, you'll want to interview your listeners on a regular basis. Best of all, there's not really a downside to surveying your guests. Here are some great questions to include in your podcast surveys for listeners. How did you learn about this podcast? How likely are you to recommend this podcast to a friend? Did you listen to the entire episode of the podcast? Who has been your favorite guest on this podcast? Who is your dream guest for a podcast episode? What is the most memorable episode of this podcast? Is there a specific topic you would like this podcast to cover? Is there a specific topic you would like us to stop covering? What device do you use to listen to the podcast? Do you do anything else while listening to the podcast? If you're wanting to improve your podcast, you must gather some helpful feedback. It's tough to know what's not working unless you ask. Jotform makes surveying subscribers and listeners easy with its podcast listener survey template. Since this template is totally customizable, you can change the questions to fit your needs, adjust the style so it fits your podcast branding, and more. With customization, you can create a podcast survey that meets your needs and gathers that helpful insight so you can take your podcast to the next level. With a little feedback and improvement, you can create a podcast that listeners and guests alike will be happy to be a part of. Let's review. If you'd like to implement a pre- or post-survey for podcast guests, make sure to include thoughtful questions like, were you comfortable and engaged during this podcast episode? And is there anything we can do to make the interview process more enjoyable? If you want to send out surveys to your listeners and subscribers, try asking questions about the podcast makeup like, Who is your dream guest to have on the podcast? And is there a specific topic you'd like us to cover or one that you'd like us to stop covering? Until next time, I'm Noel with Jotform. Don't forget to click subscribe, and thanks for watching.